such a morning as well as afternoon is indeed what's lying ahead all of us. I'm Prakya Pandey, executive of our department. Today, no other moment could have been better and prouder than to have this amazing opportunity to welcome you all on behalf of our entire department. The 3 days journey that started on 22nd October 2020 with an intriguing panel discussion with two of the esteemed panelists on a very essential topic that is India in United Nations has now reached to its concluding day on which we are having a webinar led by two prominent ambassadors who will be sharing their precious knowledge as well as their own experiences with all of us on two different yet related topics. Our conclave, Vrittan, Vocalizing Visions, is dedicated to the United Nations Day celebrated on 24th October every year, that is today. And this year we are witnessing its 75th anniversary, hence its Diamond Jubilee. On the same date of the year 1945, 51 countries came together to live with the purpose of promoting peace and cooperation around the world. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly declared 24th October the anniversary of the Charter of the United Nations, as which, quote unquote, shall be devoted to making known to the people of the world the aims and achievements of the United Nations and to gaining their support for its work. Today, in order to elaborate on the position of United Nations during the COVID pandemic, we have with us Ambassador DILIP SINHA sir. I would now like to introduce SINHA sir to our audience. Sir is an Indian diplomat and former public administrator. He joined the Indian Foreign Services in 1978, where he served until 2014. He was the director in the Prime Minister's Office, India from 1992 to 1995 during Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao's tenure. Next to which, he served as India's ambassador to Greece from 2007 to 2010. Then again at the Ministry of External Affairs, India, he served as Special Secretary and Additional Secretary from 2010 to 2012. Also, Sir headed India's UN affairs during his membership of the Security Council in the eventful period from 2011 to 2012. From 2012 to 14, he served as India's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, during which he was also elected as the Vice President of the UN Human Rights Council and Vice Chairman of the South Center. During his diplomatic career, Sinha sir served in Germany, Egypt, Pakistan, Brazil, Bangladesh, and Greece. Apart from his profession, Sir is also a public speaker on international security and environmental diplomacy. Moreover, in 2018, Sir authored one of the significant works titled as Legitimacy of Power, the Permanence of Five in the Security Council. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Haukum Wepe, sir, Assistant Professor of our department, to officially welcome Sinha sir as well as address the gathering. Over to you, sir.
A very good morning to everyone who are gathered here today. It is my pleasure to welcome all the participants on the final day of Vrittan, Vocalizing Visions. It is indeed a special privilege to welcome our eminent speaker, Ambassador DILIP SINHA, distinguished diplomat, public administrator, writer, and public speaker who have come here to share his knowledge and vast experience with the student community. This is the first webinar in the history of our department, which is completely conducted on a digital platform in line with social distancing norms due to COVID-19 pandemic. The theme of today's panel discussion is titled, The Position of the United Nations During and Post-Pandemic. In my opinion, the time is now right to reflect upon a number of questions. Today, the United Nations is at the crossroad to the future. History taught us the fact that crisis catalyzed states to rise above inertia, myopia, and narrow self-interest. This was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, conferences of Bretton Woods and San Francisco in the 1940s. The present pandemic is similar to the crisis that can lead to tectonic shift in the global affairs. Against this background, it is pertinent to answer some of the puzzles before us in understanding the position of the United Nations organization given the global pandemic. I am confident that this session will help expand our mental horizons and help us understand the dynamics of the United Nations in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. A very warm welcome to you, Ambassador DILIP SINHA. Over to you, Ambassador, sir.
Thank you, Professor Hawcom, and thank you to the Political Science Students Association of Delhi University, St. Venkateswara College students, and your own faculty for this honor that you have given me to speak to you on this topic, which is extremely current, the UN and the pandemic. And since you all students of political science, so I'll jump straight to the topic and not give any introductory lecture to you on what the UN is, etc., because you're familiar with all this. Now, this pandemic, this COVID pandemic, has come at a very difficult time for the world and for the UN. The global economy, as you know, has been in trouble since the global financial crisis of 2008. The recovery after that crisis was sluggish. And what is most significant is that there has been strong sentiments against globalization, especially in the West. And a lot of the sentiments against globalization was directed against China, which many Western countries feel and many other countries feel has been the biggest beneficiary of globalization. And it has been a beneficiary by gaming the system. And this pandemic, having originated from China, has accentuated the resentment against the country. In addition, the UN has also faced the problem of polarization within the US and the weakening support within the US and its administration of the UN. This was visible even before. There is also an unwillingness in the US to support the current international order. The other major supporter of the international order, that is Europe, the European Union, has been in a lot of internal trouble. It is essentially engaged in internal coordination. And there have also been differences that have cropped up over the last few years between the US and the EU, which again weakens the UN because these two have been the main supporters of the international order that was set up after the Second World War. Russia was never a vigorous member of this international order, and of late has been facing sanctions from the West. So it again has no reason to support the international order. It is decidedly hostile to it. And in this atmosphere, China has moved in, finding the field open for itself, and has been trying to increase its control over the existing international organizations, while at the same time undermining them and trying to develop its own institutions. So the UN and its agencies have been faced with this pandemic at a time when this global economy was weak, as I mentioned, and the pandemic has had a devastating impact on some of the major functions of the UN, primarily relating to development, especially human development, relating to humanitarian relief, and attaining the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Now, all organs of the UN are affected by this pandemic and are struggling to deal with it. We do not know how long the pandemic will last and whether and when sustained global economic recovery will take place. But it is certain that the existing trends that I have mentioned will get accelerated by this pandemic. Now, the change that will take place need not necessarily be structural. The structures, the international organizations that we have, the specialized agencies of the UN, they may well remain where they are, but they will adapt themselves to the new forces and ideas as time passes. And I'll explain this as we go along. Let's look at the very idea of a pandemic affecting the global economy and global institutions. The last such big pandemic was the Spanish flu of 1918, which you all must have made yourself familiar with. 500 million people were affected, 50 million people died, and yet you find that there's hardly any public memory of this pandemic. So what happened? Why didn't the people remember the Spanish flu the way, for example, the Black Death of the 14th century had made an impact on the minds of the people of Europe? We don't know the answer to this, except that perhaps the Spanish flu was followed by a major economic recovery, and there was the boom of the 1920s in Europe and America, and perhaps also because a lot of the devastation of the Spanish flu got mixed up with the First World War. So the argument that is made sometimes is that this pandemic is the COVID pandemic is there, but it's very soon it will go away. Once it goes away, people will forget about it, just as they forgot about the Spanish flu. But this may not necessarily happen. This global pandemic has caused the deepest global recession since the Second World War. And it is the first pandemic since that has been solely due to, the first recession that has been solely due to a pandemic. This, of course, includes the fact that the counting of global statistics, etc., started in 1870. So it is from this period that I'm mentioning this. Now, what has been the impact of this COVID? I'll just very briefly mention some of the figures that are floating around all over the place. The global GDP is likely to fall by about 4.4% this year, according to the IMF. The US economy will collapse by about the same figure. China is the only major country that is likely to grow, perhaps by 2%. India's GDP is likely to go down by about 10%. The social impact is even graver. 500 million jobs lost. 100 million people pushed below the poverty line. International travel industry and international hospitality industry in extremely dire straits. FDI has fallen by around 40%. And the UNDP estimates that the Human Development Index is likely to fall for the first time since 1990. And the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, the current period, as you know, is from 2015 to 2030, which means the UN has up to 2030 to attain these goals. But that appears to be difficult, as I said, because 100 million people have fallen below the poverty line. And statistics of health all over the world have been skewed by this pandemic. Apart from this, there is also the rather sinister downside visible of this pandemic, and that is the increase in government surveillance and the technology for surveillance. Most countries have been doing this, but China has developed and implemented its extremely sophisticated technologies in this. And there is the fear that in the garb of taking care of public health and the necessity of monitoring public behavior, governments will start using this technology more and more. And this will impact the other goals of the UN of open societies, freedom, and promoting human rights. Especially so when you look at the fact that the countries most badly affected by the COVID are liberal, open democracies. You have the US, you have Brazil, you have India at the top of the list. Whereas China, with its extremely harsh and autocratic measures, has been able to control the pandemic. At least that's what the reports indicate. And perhaps the only positive impact that you can think of the COVID is that carbon dioxide emissions fell by 8.8% in the first half of 2020. And this was the first time this has happened in the last several decades, I would think. We could all ourselves notice that our cities were cleaner during this period. But of course, as economic activity revives, and you can see in Delhi itself, pollution is back. But what this COVID pandemic has established is that the CO2 emissions can be controlled. And if one controls them, then the impact on the environment can be seen and will be visible. So it is something that can be done if the world gets down to it. Now let's come to the main organization that has dealt with this pandemic or is responsible for dealing with this pandemic, which is the World Health Organization. The WHO, as you know, is one of the 15 specialized agencies of the UN, formed in 1948 after amalgamating a number of earlier health organizations, including the Health Organization of the League of Nations. It has 194 members. It has its own assembly, the World Health Assembly. It has its own budget. Operationally, it is independent of the UN, but they are all linked under the UN umbrella, as all specialized agencies are. It's budget is $2.4 billion annually. But here comes the catch. Only 20% of it comes from assessed contributions of member states. Now, the assessed contributions are the regular budget of the organization, which is controlled by the World Health Assembly, and World Health Assembly then decides how it's going to be spent. The remaining 80% comes from governments and from private entities, including pharmaceutical companies, through voluntary donations. And there's always this feeling and often open criticism of the fact that these voluntary donations are directed again into specific programs that the donor wishes to be carried out. And therefore, these voluntary donations impact the programs and priorities of the organization. And this has been coming up in the past also. So this is one of the difficulties that an organization like WHO faces. But fortunately, in the pandemic, all governments have come together to deal with the matter. Of course, there has been this other criticism of the WHO that the influence of China was strong, and perhaps it led to the WHO being negligent in the early stages, both in warning the world about the pandemic and also perhaps in taking action in identifying the causes of the pandemic, where it came from and the origins of it. In terms of the longer term impact of the pandemic, it's difficult to predict how much this will be there, because we don't know how long the pandemic will last. Certainly, the disenchantment with globalization and the rise of protectionism will become stronger. And this will impact many of the organizations that deal with these subjects, especially the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is not a specialized agency of the UN, but it is related to the UN. So it is part of the global international organizations. The WTO itself was already in trouble even before the US had been unwilling to let anybody be nominated to the appellate tribunal, which impacted the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, which has been now lying dormant for some time. Now with the pandemic and the rise in protectionism, one can expect that the WTO will go into further hibernation. As it is, they are trying to elect the DG, and they are through that process right now. The other is that the free trade agreements that were in the pipeline earlier, they had slowed down. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, had been abandoned by the US. India had walked out of the RCEP. The Doha development round of the WTO was as good as dead. So one can expect that free trade agreements will also slow down because of this pandemic. In terms of the impact of the COVID, one can also find that there has been a crash in demand all across the world. And governments are trying to stimulate demand by pumping, giving fiscal stimuli to the economy. And the total stimulus so far has been by governments amounts to $11 trillion, which is about 12% of the GDP. Now, if you compare this with what happened when the 2008 global financial crisis took place, you find that at that time, the total stimulus was only $3 trillion. So the current stimulus is much more than the earlier one. And the organization that deals with this matter and generally advises countries is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund, surprisingly, has opened its coffers. Since March 2020, it has expanded its lending by almost 1/3. So its total lending is now about $280 billion. It has become extremely liberal in releasing funds to countries that have gone to it for liquidity and for balance of payments problems. And the IMF is self-advising governments that they must pay attention to public health and also provide enough liquidity to the system to be able to meet with the crash in demand that the economies are facing. And this coming from the IMF, which is the bastion of the free market economy and has always upheld that government should not interfere in the economy. This is a major development for it. In fact, the IMF has also been talking about the fact about the need for a comprehensive agreement on digital taxation. Now, this again is a new concept because you do not have any international agreement so far on taxing companies that are multinational. Taxation is a national prerogative of national governments, but because of this globalization and companies moving into tax havens, governments have been facing the problem of how do you tax these multinational companies, especially digital companies. And if you look at all the top companies in the world, whether it is Amazon or it is other companies, Google, they are all digital companies which can move very easily from one headquarters to another. And on this, the IMF has said that there is need for a comprehensive agreement on digital taxation. Talk on this is going on both in the European Commission and in the OECD. OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. This is a 37-member body of the advanced economies of the world. It is based in Paris. So they are talking about this digital global taxation agreement. And also significantly, the IMF has said in its most recent report that governments need to tax the rich to augment their revenue. But this, again, as you know, is a new concept for the world and especially for organizations like the IMF, where they are now recognizing the fact that governments need to increase the taxation revenue, and this includes taxing the rich. Another key advice that has come from one of the UN organizations is from UNCTAD, which has said that there should be a peace clause like you have in a war agreement or a ceasefire agreement, in a peace clause on WTO treaties. The WTO treaties, as you know, are treaties like TRIPS in particular, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Treaty. They have this general impression that these treaties, especially TRIPS, prevents governments from providing medicines to the poor at affordable rates because of all kinds of licensing and patenting rights and problems. So UNCTAD has advised that there should be a temporary peace clause in WTO treaties to enable governments to provide for compulsory licensing and for other means to be able to provide medicines to the poor at affordable rates. And the WTO itself has released its own information saying that reassuring countries that WTO treaties do not prevent them from taking steps to provide medicines to the poor at affordable rates. So this again is a change from the situation, let's say 10 years ago, when most UN institutions would be advising countries to be strict about non-interference in the economy and not violating intellectual property rights, etc., and not taxing too much. Then I'll come to the other part, which is which accentuates the problem for the UN, is China's rise. Now, China, as you know, is a late entrant to the international order. It became a member of the UN only in 1971. It became a member of IMF and World Bank in 1980 and of the WTO in 2001. But thereafter, China's rise has been so phenomenal that it becomes, in fact, the most defining change in the international order in the last 2 to 3 decades. But why is China's rise considered to be a challenge for the UN? Now let's look at China's record. China shows very little commitment, in fact, no commitment to the values of the UN like democracy, human rights, peaceful settlement of disputes. It is the only major country that is not a party to the most basic of the international covenants, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I think about 177 countries have ratified this treaty. Besides, China has constantly had this feeling that it must use force to settle international disputes, whether it is saber rattling against Taiwan or it is rejecting international arbitration in South China Sea. And the other is this desire of China to dominate the UN and its specialized agencies. You'll be surprised to know that of the 15 specialized agencies of the UN, Chinese nationals head 4 of them: UNIDO, ICAO, ITU, and one more, I forget the name now. Now, no other country has ever dominated or headed 4 organizations at the same time. But not satisfied with this, China in March this year wanted to contest the DG-ship of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and it lost only in the last round to Singapore. So apart from this desire, China also adopts the technique that the Western countries have been adopting to control international organizations. I mentioned about the voluntary donations to WHO. Now, voluntary donations are used by the Western countries in almost all international organizations to control them and to control their activities. And there's another technique that they use, which is that they are permitted to, a country is permitted to deploy its own staff, its own government staff, as professionals in international organizations. The international organization does not pay the salaries or meet the expenses of this officer, so they are being paid for by the donor country. Now, this again is I would think it's against the spirit of the international organization, because international civil servants are supposed to be international in character, supposed to be neutral. But when a country deputes its own personnel to these organizations on a voluntary basis, they work for the government that pays them. And China has adopted these techniques and places its people in different organizations. And of course, there are other reports and charges about China using other underhand means as well. Now, the result of this has been that the UN is faced with further antagonism among its major members, meaning essentially the permanent 5, because the permanent 5, although the permanent 5 concept is there only in the Security Council, the fact is that in the other organizations also, the permanent 5 do have much greater influence than other organizations because of their structural position in the Security Council. But the EU has recently designated China as a systemic rival. So this again increases the antagonism among the permanent 5, and these being the major members, they affect the functioning of the UN on a day-to-day basis. For example, Japan has recently followed a policy of encouraging its companies to leave China and has earmarked $3.2 billion to support companies, Japanese companies, which leave China. So all this antagonism among the major countries affects the functioning of an intergovernmental organization like the UN. Now, the Security Council, of course, as we know, has been deadlocked for a long period of time, especially since about 2011, when the last major resolution was passed by the US on Libya, which resulted in Russia and China thereafter joining hands not to allow any further action by the Security Council, whether it was in Syria or in Yemen. So the UN is now reduced to merely sending special envoys to war zone countries to try and see if they can agree upon a ceasefire. And the most recent success of this has been the special envoy to Libya, where yesterday they managed to sign an agreement. But no further action, like the Security Council is authorized to take military action or to impose sanctions, these have not been permitted by China and Russia. And with the pandemic and the antagonism among the P5 increasing, the chances of these recede further. The other difficulty that you face is this for the UN, is the model that China is offering to other developing countries to deal with situations like the pandemic. I mentioned to you that the pandemic has had its worst impact on liberal democracies, and the least on a country like China. And China is actually offering itself as a role model for developing countries, its one-party rule system and its authoritarian regime, and claiming that this is good not only for promoting accelerated and faster development, but also for dealing with pandemics like COVID-19. So we have a situation where the present UN machinery, its various international organizations, various specialized agencies, and its other organs are facing a major problem. The question is, what are the prospects of change in this? Now, if you look at the state of the degree of consensus and agreement that exists today among the major powers, you'll understand that this is almost impossible. Countries will just not be able to agree upon any kind of change, just as they're not able to agree upon any change in the UN Security Council. Any other reform in any of the international organizations appears to be extremely difficult. Let's look at the actual experience. In the WTO, the US has been clamoring for reforms, but between the US and the EU itself, there has been no agreement on what kind of reforms should be carried out. The US and the EU have been trying to harmonize their laws in the financial sector, like banking standards, liquidity requirements, clearing houses, etc. But they have not been able to come to an agreement because of all kinds of economic and political differences. And the likelihood of an agreement taking place between the US and EU on the one side and China and Russia on the other are as good as non-existent. So what you have is that the current fluid situation is likely to continue. The US and China will continue to influence each other and jostle for power. And in this kind of a situation, the other countries just have to sit and wait for international organizations to become more active or to be able to overcome their differences. Now, this need not necessarily be a bad situation for other countries, because when the big powers unite, then we have seen what happened in the 1990s when all kinds of military invasions took place. So differences among the top five are not necessarily bad for the other countries. But, and this brings me to the last part of my talk, which is what are the implications of this for India, that this can be considered an opportunity for a country like India, that is to be able to play a bigger role, as India did perhaps in the 1950s and 60s when the Cold War was going on. And in the Security Council, the US and the Soviet Union were at loggerheads. At that time, India played a very prominent role in the General Assembly in promoting decolonization, disarmament, anti-apartheid movement. So is this possible in this present environment? And I think that, of course, is an idea that is possible only if India were to be able to seize this opportunity, because the most important problem with India today is that its own economic growth is not fast enough for it to become a major player in the global economy. And the other problem is that in a Cold War situation between the US and China, India cannot afford to be non-aligned as it was in the Cold War, because none of the two big powers in the Cold War had anything against India as such. So India faced no security threat from either of those two. But in the case of a Cold War between China and the US, India has security concerns with one of the two parties, mainly China. So India will have to be constantly conscious of the fact that if it tries to promote cooperation with China, then there are certain security implications that it will have to deal with. And given the antagonism between China and the US, if India leans towards the US, then China becomes even more hostile to India. So in this atmosphere, for India to balance the two and to promote its own interests will be a challenge, including increasing cooperation with the West, because increasing cooperation with the West and integrating India's economy with the West will also require major changes and major reforms in the country, which had started in 1990, but have not been completed, and still is a long task. So this pandemic has, as I said, made the situation extremely difficult for the UN and its organizations, and also for a country like India. There are opportunities for both to make changes and move ahead, but that will depend upon their the capacity in the case of the UN, or being able to get the member states to it, and in the case of India, to get our own government and people to move forward in this direction. So I'll conclude with this. Thank you.
That was indeed a very thought-provoking as well as insightful session, sir. And all the points that you have mentioned were really, like they covered the topic in a very nuanced manner. Thank you so much, sir, for that. Now, moving on, I would like to initiate the question and answer session. Our team has already gathered some questions, which I'll be calling out the names of the people who have asked those questions, and they will have to use the feature here hand raise feature or thumbs up feature so that they will be unmuted. So the first question was asked by Ayush. So if you want to ask the question, you can unmute yourself.
For the opportunity. Good morning, sir. Thank you for your enlightening session. So I have a question that is it possible for any country to dictate WHO as it is said about China holding WHO back? And if so, then what's the solution?
That is the problem that all international organizations face, that they are, after all, intergovernmental organizations. And the UN has this other characteristic, this feature in its charter, that it is not supposed to interfere in matters that are essentially within the internal jurisdiction of a country. So what happens inside a country if a disease breaks out is essentially an internal matter of the country, and the WHO or any other international organization can come in only in cooperation with the government to help the country out. Now, will this change with this pandemic? Well, there certainly is a demand for this, that this must change, because in a globalized world, no country can live like a fortress. But at the moment, there is no prospect of this. China, of course, will be under tremendous amount of pressure to open up further. Otherwise, it might face at least opprobrium. Sanctions is a very strong word, perhaps not likely against China. But if it were a smaller country, let's say there are certain countries in Africa, then it might face travel restrictions because of the disease, or it might even face sanctions. But that is unlikely against China. And the fact that China is a major economic power, which induces countries to seek closer economic cooperation with it, means that it is very difficult to isolate China economically in the world. So at the moment, there is no answer to this. We have to go along with this as globalization increases and we move forward in our concept of international cooperation through international organizations.
Thank you, sir. Sir, relating to Chinese economic dominance in the world, I have another question, that China has been given power of veto in the United Nations. And we see that Chinese principles are quite contradictory to that of UN, as you mentioned, regarding peaceful conflict resolution and principles of democracy. Then how rightful is it for China to have veto power in that very organization, considering only the economic domination it has in the world and not the principles it abides by?
Oh God, that is a very, very sore point. You know how China got into the UN? In 1945, when the permanent powers were being decided, there were essentially three main powers at that time: the Soviet Union, Britain, and the US. President Roosevelt was very keen to bring China in because he had a special interest in China. I don't want to go into the history of it, but it was he who brought China in. Churchill was extremely skeptical about China's claim to be a major power. But Roosevelt was adamant, and China was brought in. France was brought in because Britain then wanted France to come in. And that is how you had France and China brought in as permanent members of the Security Council. Now, as you know, 4 years later, the Communist Party came into power in China, and the Republic of China went into Taiwan, and the PRC was kept out of the UN till 1971. And in 1971, as you know, there was Nixon went to China and improved relations with China because the US realized that in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, it was good to have China as an ally. And once the US opened up with China, you had a situation where other countries then started softening towards China. And I think it was Albania that introduced a resolution in the General Assembly, simply stating that the seat of China should go to the PRC. And that resolution was adopted by a simple majority. 76 countries voted for it, out of 133 or something. So it was a very simple majority. The US voted against it. Incidentally, India voted for that resolution. Don't ask me why, but we did. So with that simple resolution, PRC replaced ROC in the Security Council. And since then, China has been a member of the Security Council. The question whether China accepts UN principles and values or not was never discussed or questioned there. In fact, you'll be also surprised to know that in 1951, there was a resolution of the General Assembly declaring China to be an invader in the Korean War. So China has the distinction of having been declared by the General Assembly an invader country. Of course, way back, that's forgotten now. But that's how it is. The fact is that once the US had got over to supporting China's membership, the other countries simply fell in line. India, in any case, had never opposed China's membership. In fact, India was a strong proponent of China's membership, PRC's membership. From 1950 itself, we had been supporting it. So you had other countries supporting as well. So China just walked in. And China so far has also been claiming to be a supporter of a multipolar world. So instead of a bipolar, you have a multipolar world. And that is something that countries have taken in. India itself has joined with China in many international organizations. In BRICS, for example, New Development Bank, the Contingency Reserve Fund. So it is not as if other countries have been soft towards China. We ourselves have also been soft towards China in the past. Perhaps there was a time in the 1980s, in the period of Deng Xiaoping, etc., when China's policies were slightly more moderate and therefore justified the position. But even then, if you recall, in Deng Xiaoping's time, China had attacked Vietnam, a much smaller country. And of course, now it's a different leadership in China, and it is also under question. But that's how it is. Now that China is a permanent member of the Security Council, it is very difficult to remove it from there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the answer.
Now we have another question from Arkaprabha Haldar. Arkaprabha, if you want to ask the question, kindly raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll be reading it out.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Session was in
Arkaprabha, you're having some technical issues on your side. We're not able to.
I guess Arka Prabha has also sent his question in the chat, and we'll read out his.
Please.
Sir, so he wants to ask that, don't you think with the current attempts made by China in establishing hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, as well as China trying to overtake US in trade, this is the right time and context to reform the structure of UNSC and add India as a permanent member?
Well, India's claim to a permanent membership is independent of China's role and domination or attempts to dominate the international order, because India's claim to permanent membership is based upon India's size. It's the size of its economy, its population, and the fact that with India's population, which is what it is, a very large section of the global population, no international organization that does not have India as a member can claim itself, can call itself an international organization. So it's but natural and rightful for India to join the Security Council as a permanent member, regardless of China's policies and its position. Now, the problem, of course, is that China, being hostile to India, does not want India to become a permanent member of the Security Council, totally disregarding the fact that India was one of the major supporters of China in the PRC in the days when it wasn't a member. But that is how it is. China is opposed to India's membership. And since it has the veto, it would be difficult for India to become a permanent member of the Security Council as long as China is opposed to it. What can be done about it? I really don't know, because there are some people who believe that if China is isolated, if the other countries come forward and support India, and if India becomes and gets overwhelming support internationally, then China will not stand in the way. Now, that is anybody's guess. Will China say no at that time or not? Your guess is as good as mine. What we do know is that in 2005, when the G4 had moved a resolution in the General Assembly and was pressing for its resolution for the expansion of the Security Council, at that time there were two countries that were extremely active in Africa and other smaller countries, persuading them not to vote for the G4 resolution. And these two countries were the US and China. So that gives you a picture of where things stand. The US policy has, I believe, over the years changed, but China's policy certainly hasn't.
Okay, so Shubham, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. I'd like to ask that in the pandemic times, we have seen Trump withdrawing US funding from WHO. And then I was looking at the funding structure. So the second highest funder of WHO is actually Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I want to know as to what impact this funding crunch has had on an organization like United Nations, which at the end of the day is simply an international non-governmental organization. So there have been a lot of downsizing of economy of a lot of nations. How has this affected UN's current role and power? And are there any reforms that is to be employed in the financial sector for UN?
Funding is a major problem for the UN, whether it is the Security Council or it is the other international organizations. I told you about the funding structure of the WHO, where only 20% of its program budget comes from assessed contribution of member states. Assessed contribution means what is the mandatory contribution that a country must make. Depending upon the size of its GDP, its share is decided by the WHO, and a country has to contribute. Most rich countries or donor countries do not like assessed contribution, because the assessed contribution goes into a general pool, and it is the the assembly or the general body of that organization that decides how it's going to be spent. The donor country has no control over it. But in the voluntary contributions, the donor country dictates where the money goes and how it's to be spent. In the Security Council, of course, there is this other problem that the Security Council itself has the assessed contribution, but the peacekeeping forces get money through the extra budgetary resources, which is the peacekeeping fund, to which countries make contributions. And the peacekeeping contribution fund, for example, has actually gone down very marginally, but in the last biennium to the current biennium, there's a marginal decline. Now, the impact of this is that the Security Council has not started any other peacekeeping operation, any new peacekeeping operation in the last, I think, since 2005, because there are no funds for it. And the troop contributing countries often have to wait for the payment to be made by the UN to them. The US, of course, has been negligent in this for a long time, even before China's rise. If you go back to Boutros Ghali, one of the major reasons why he had a dispute with the US was, and he couldn't get a second term, was because he felt that the US was holding back money and trying to dictate to him. Once he had to go to I think it was President Bush or Clinton, one of the two, whom he went to and asking for money because the US was withholding its contribution. If you remember, I think it was last year that the US withheld its contribution, and the UN was in danger of not being able to pay its salaries to its staff. In the UN, the rule is that if a country does not pay its assessed contribution for 2 years, or if its dues exceed 2 years contribution or share, then it loses its voting right. So the US has ensured that while it is always in default, its outstanding amount never exceeds 2 years of its dues to the UN. So that's how it's able to keep a tight leash on the UN. China, fortunately, has not adopted this tactic, but China adopts other tactics, which is to use voluntary donations and also very often underhand payments to the secretariat staff and to other officials and delegates of smaller countries. That's it.
Okay, so now we have another question from Shubham Swaraj. He's asking that we have been witnessing countries losing faith in multilateral organization. Talk about US funding reduction in UN or Brexit. What can UN do to restore this belief?
I'm afraid the UN, this is a problem that emanates from the member states themselves. The UN is not a world government. It is an intergovernmental organization. All decisions of international organizations are taken by the member states when they meet in either the assembly of the organization. In the case of the UN itself, the UN General Assembly decides the budget allocation, the assessed contribution, etc. The major activities are approved. In the case of the World WHO, it is the World Health Assembly, and then there's an executive board that takes decisions. There is a secretariat, but the secretariat is there to serve the member states, and that becomes a major problem for the UN, because if it were only the assessed contributions that were the major part of their funding, then they would have a certain degree of autonomy. But where it is coming through voluntary contributions, then the staff is totally dependent upon the donor country. And in fact, there are jokes in the UN, in the secretariats of these various international organizations, that if you want to keep your job in the secretariat, then you have to prepare a program for which you can get a donor. If there is no donor available, then your program lapses, and once your program lapses, you lose your job and you come back to your country or do whatever. So the secretariat staff, for them, it's a question of saving their own jobs rather than worrying about what the UN, the special agency, can do or what the UN can do. So it is a very difficult situation, and the UN itself can't do very much about it. It has to be the major powers, the major donors, who have to agree that their contribution has to be like the way it is in a country where a person paying a tax has no control over how the money is going to be spent. That's the government's prerogative, but not here in the UN and international organizations. So this is something that has to take further time to evolve as we move towards a more globalized world.
Now we have the last question from Shreyash Sinha's side. He's saying that, sir, as you mentioned about increased governmental surveillance during this pandemic, in some sense, it is even necessary at present. But since we have learned from 9/11 attacks as well, that once the governments put in place surveillance measures, it is very difficult to roll them back again. So how do you think that during this pandemic, when governments have increased their surveillance, how will it be, like, how a stop will be put on it by the UN and related organizations?
Well, the UN can play a role in this, because the UN will be one place where countries can share ideas. And once you are sitting in an international forum, then it is a country has to project an image of being liberal and open to show to the world that they are not an authoritarian regime back home. So once you sit in an international setting, then it is possible for countries to come up with ideas to be able to develop international norms on privacy, which is extremely important in the digital age, on the degree of control that a government can exercise on data flowing in and out of the country, or the extent of control that it can exercise on its people, especially the degree of arresting a person, of taking him into custody. Because in the Human Rights Council, for example, you have there are 9 major international human rights treaties which seek to identify how much liberty a government should provide to its people. And in these international settings, it is possible to come up with international agreements which can then be used by the people to put pressure on their own governments to accept. Now, India, of course, does not accept that, does not permit Indian citizens to appeal directly to international organizations, but some countries do. And in those situations, the government itself can be held answerable in these forums, the committees of the Human Rights Council. But whatever it is, the fact is that when a discussion takes place in an international organization, it is possible to develop international norms and then use them to try and get governments to accept those international norms and respect them so that their international image remains intact. Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much, sir, for this enlightening session. We all have taken a lot and learned a lot from the session, definitely. Now we'll be having another session with Nambiar, sir. And if you would like to, then you can also be a part of it. It will be a great pleasure for all of us, but only if you like to, sir.
Thank you. I'll see if I have some calls coming up here, so I'll attend to these and see if the same number applies, the same
Yes,
join. Can you see me? How are you, sir?
Hi, fine, fine. How are you, Dilip?
I'm fine, sir. I'm fine, and I look forward to hearing you. I'll certainly keep my audio and I'll switch off my video so that I don't disturb you.
Oh, okay.
I look forward to hearing you.
Oh, there's nothing new that I'm going to say which you don't know.
Please go ahead. Over to you, students.
Thank you so much, sir.
Ayush, please start.
Yeah. Let us begin with the second session now. Hello again, a very didactic afternoon to everyone present here, virtually experiencing this politically edifying seminar. I am Ayush, the Chief Treasurer of Political Science Department. And this is a proud moment for me to have gotten this opportunity of welcoming you on behalf of our department. The 3 days journey that started on 22nd October with an intriguing panel discussion on two highly esteemed panelists, a very essential and urgent topic, India in United Nations, has now reached to its concluding day, on which we are having a webinar led by two prominent ambassadors who will be sharing their precious knowledge and experiences on two very related topics of acute importance in today's world and time. As we know that our conclave Vritt, Vocalizing Vision, is dedicated to the United Nations Day, which is celebrated on 24th October every year. And this year we are witnessing its 75th anniversary, hence the Diamond Jubilee of the United Nations. And to elaborate on the future of United Nations in the post-pandemic world, we now have the presence of Ambassador Sir Vijay Nambiar with us. Mr. Vijay Nambiar is a former special advisor of the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon from 2012 to 2016. He served as chef de cabinet to the Secretary General at the rank of Under Secretary General. Earlier in 2006, Mr. Nambiar also served as special advisor to Secretary General Kofi Annan. Prior to joining the United Nations, Mr. Nambiar served as the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of India of the National Security Council Secretariat. He was India's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York from May 2002 till June 2004. Earlier, he served as ambassadors at Algeria, Afghanistan, Malaysia, China, and Pakistan. With this, I invite Dr. Haukum sir to formally invite Ambassador Nambiar sir. Haukum sir.
A very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the second session of the final day of the 3-day conclave Vrittan, Vocalizing Visions. We are extremely delighted to welcome our eminent speaker, Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, distinguished diplomat, public administrator, public speaker, and former chef de cabinet of the United Nations. It is a proud moment for us to have you here to share your expertise, experience, and valuable insights on the United Nations organization. Sir, this is the first webinar in the history of our department, which is completely conducted on a digital platform due to COVID-19 pandemic. Today's session is titled The Position of the United Nations During and Post-Pandemic. We know all is not well with COVID-19 pandemic. As it spreads across the globe and nations strive to save their people and economies, the United Nations will need to step up to save the world order from collapse. I quote Turkey's Ambassador Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th United Nations General Assembly. The outbreak has coincided with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. This is a stark reminder of the importance of effective multilateralism, and particularly the crucial role of the UN and its agencies, unquote. With this, it is indeed an honor to welcome Ambassador Vijay NAMBIAR on this momentous occasion to throw light on the difficult questions of the United Nations arising out of COVID-19 pandemic. Over to you, Ambassador, sir.
Let me, first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to meet up with all of you on this particular day, which is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I can't speak about the present and the future without going a little into the past. So you'll excuse me if I perhaps say some things which you probably heard before in the course of your 2-day conclave or 3-day conclave. I'm extremely happy to be here at the Political Science Department of the Sri Venkateswara College and to see that you have been grappling with a whole series of issues over the past 2 days. Let me first of all say that the 75 years of the United Nations has actually survived is quite an achievement, considering that its predecessor, which was formed 100 years ago, the League of Nations, did not even survive it was more or less moribund by a decade and a half. And something therefore must have worked with regard to the United Nations, that it was able to, in a sense, reinvent itself and work over the past 70 years and more, 75 years. Now, this reinvention, we have to understand, and the transformations that the UN has been able to achieve over the past 75 years, we must be able to at least understand. It was based on at least 1 or 2 major issues. And that is, one, if the UN has been able to reinvent itself, it has had perhaps to take account of certain realities of the international political and geostrategic environment that helped it to survive. And at the same time, it has been able to evolve. Now, the one thing that the people talk about how the UN has evolved over 75 years, it has actually over the years achieved great transformation of the world, in a sense. If you recall, Kofi Annan did talk about certain inspirational concepts which the UN had brought into the world, and that itself is seen in its composition, the growth of the United Nations from 52 members to 193 members. That itself was the first big inspirational idea, the idea of independence and decolonization, which started as early as 1960 and which resulted in the phenomenal change that took place in the international political environment and resulted in the independence of states. Then, of course, there was the question of peace. The whole question, as the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, said, the idea behind the United Nations was not so much to take people to a kind of heavenly state, but to prevent itself from proceeding to hell. And that in the early years of the Cold War, it represented working against the outbreak of another cataclysmic war. And by and large, I think the UN has helped in preventing the outbreak of cataclysmic international conflagration around the world. This is not, of course, meant that there hasn't been conflict. There have been a whole series of conflicts. There have been some incredibly disastrous wars, but many of them have taken place outside the ambit of the United Nations, and the United Nations was not at all involved. This is particularly so in the case of during the Cold War. Now, it was in the non-political areas that the UN has actually engaged with the international community and brought out certain staggering transformations around the world. And that is in development, the whole idea of development, particularly during the 90s, when under the influence of eminent people like Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul-Haq, the idea of human development was brought out. And that actually developed into what subsequently became the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and the SDGs, which you now see with 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. And then, of course, the idea of human rights, the questions of building charter-based as well as treaty-based, a whole regime of issues. These represent the the major changes that the UN has been able to bring about in the course of 50 to 75 years. New concepts like responsibility to protect came, particularly after the end of the Cold War. Now, in some respects, as I said, the United Nations has had to survive because it has actually stuck to the realities of the international political environment. In this sense, I think the basic structure, what in India we recognize in the constitution, under what is called the Keshavananda Bharati decision, the idea of basic structure applies also to the UN Charter, I think, in some respects. And that basic structure, which is really the power of the P5, the permanent five, has not changed. And that, because it has not changed, I think to an extent that has helped the UN to survive. But I think today, in today's world, when the basic structure of international politics has changed, I think it may be important for the United Nations, if it has to survive as a credible body, to think in terms of reorienting, realigning the basic structure of the United Nations to some of the monumental, some of the decisive changes that have taken place in the world over the last 10 years, particularly in the new century. And let me say that, on the other hand, there is much, particularly at the end of the Cold War, there was a great deal of emphasis on how the UN should adopt a new agenda for change. And that agenda for change at one stage represented a certain amount of a kind of sense among the major powers, particularly in the Western world, that they had reached what they call the end of history, etc. And ideas like the colored revolutions, the Arab Spring, and the hearkening of a new era of governance, etc., came about. But most of these tended to be perverted as a result of the UN, of the major powers using these developments, in a sense, for their own narrow agendas. And it was, I would suggest, that it was the hubris of the big powers that actually prevented some of the major transformations from going into a much more open and, let's say, freer, much more a world of greater international harmony. And that was because, particularly after the end of the Cold War and the push for building greater consolidation among the states of the developing world, which were increasingly becoming fragile, suffering from internal fragility, and there was the focus of peacekeeping began to be on internal consolidation. And here, the agendas of the big powers resulted in hubris on the one hand, double standards, divisions among the P5, lack of sustained attention, and of course, lack of an ability to appreciate the genuine aspirations of the developing world. And thus you saw that very, very good concepts like responsibility to protect, the development of international humanitarian law tended to be, in a sense, differently interpreted, and then brought about a whole series of social disruptions, disorders, fragmentation, terrorism, the situation of migration and xenophobic nationalism. You see this developing in the current world now, particularly in places like Libya, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, the Sahel, and Central Africa. Now, this is the broad ambit, as it were, of all the developments in the world. Today, in a sense, the UN itself has changed. It is more, the nature of international society has changed, and the UN has changed with it. The UN today has increasingly sought to focus on the first three words of the Charter: we the people. An international organization like the UN is essentially a forum of states. It is the states that have a vote, not the people. But yet, today the UN has changed substantially to be more than just a collection of member states. It is increasingly given a role to civil society through the work of NGOs, to philanthropic organizations, and even to business groups. And on many issues, particularly those outside the purview of peace and security, are increasingly being addressed, and the cooperation of civil society, of business groups, philanthropic groups are being increasingly sought. And I think they do play a very important role. Now, side by side with that, of course, we see that the world has become so much more interconnected. There's the digital revolution. There are issues like climate change, international health issues, food issues, and financial and trade relationships and linkages, which have actually made the world very much more intertwined, interconnected, interlinked, and interdependent. And it is at this time that we are now seeing also some of the baneful effects, as it were, of this interconnections, this interconnected society, which is not working for all people all around the world. And I think, therefore, you have been seeing over the past few years an increasing movement, a retraction, a movement away from globalization, from the interconnections. And we are seeing people wanting to build protectionist barriers, etc. I think this is something which, in a sense, is a reaction to what is perceived as not working for some of those countries that have been most affected adversely by these developments. But I don't think that the globalization or the interdependencies of the world can actually be set back. You cannot put the genie back into the bottle. And in that sense, I think what the world must look forward is to build more and more on the interdependencies and provide to the most vulnerable a set of global public goods which can be used equitably and fairly by all people around the world. And I think these ideas like human security, etc., have increasingly come about. Now, I think today the pandemic has, in a sense, even before the sustainable development, when the sustainable development goals were being discussed, there was also a major involvement of the international community in what is called the disaster risk reduction and mitigation efforts, which was held in Japan. And I think these, there has been involvement in what may be called the effects of public health, of food security, of poverty, etc., around the world, and which will be, in a sense, affecting the most vulnerable. And it is despite the fact that lessons had been learned initially, both in the Ebola crisis in Africa, as well as in the SARS crisis, these lessons, when it came to applying them, there were major problems in the case of the latest COVID. And in that sense, the health crisis of COVID last year has shown, and this year has shown us that the more we experience these things, the less we learn from it. And it is important, just as in the case of other issues, as in the case of human rights issues around the world, they tend to repeat. They're the same kind of faults tend to repeat ourselves. And therefore, it is important that the world now look at the impact of disasters, of climate change events in a more holistic manner. What is required today is a global response. And as you say, as you probably know, just 2-3 days ago, the Deputy Secretary General did address a major meeting on the COVID challenge, and she called for building the response in terms of whether it was vaccines, access to vaccines, whether it was access to diagnostics, or whether it's access to therapeutics in terms of how to address the effects, the painful effects of COVID-19. This should be treated as a global public good. And increasingly, all countries should have access, equitable access to these in line with their requirements, and it should not be left to the whims of the marketplace and to go to those who have the let's say the biggest pockets. And in that sense, I think the World Bank has already come up with what is called the Access to COVID Treatment Accelerator sort of program, which I think they've put a certain amount of money, or some 12 billion or so, to be able to be accessed by the most vulnerable, the least developed countries, in order to be able to address the public health challenges that the COVID-19 has raised for most countries. Now, it is therefore important looking forward to accept that there has to be a global response to many of these public health challenges, both the first degree challenges as well as the second and third degree challenges, and the impact these challenges will have on the larger economies, on the food availability, on the on the economic development of the vulnerable countries. And therefore, there has to be not just a global response, but within countries, within societies, a whole of society response. And I think that must be something. It is increasingly to be agreed that while individual nations, individual countries will have obviously to attend to the concerns of their own people, it must be done within the context of an interest that transcends narrow national interests. And therefore, it must be more inclusive and include the requirements of the most vulnerable. And there must be a better balanced burden sharing, as it were, between the costs of being able to address the requirements of this particular global pandemic. Therefore, what is needed, especially among those who have the capacities, is not greater muscularity in terms of treatment and addressing the problems raised by both, but not just the health-related issues, but the larger economic, financial, and even political impact of the COVID-19. What is required is not more muscularity, but greater smartness. And here, I think when you say smart, a smart response, the smart response, I mean in terms of what I don't know if many of you have heard about a person named Inga Koll, who was in the UNDP several years ago. She talked about what may be called smart sovereignty. Even sovereignty should be exercised increasingly in what she calls a smart way. There may be occasions when individual countries will have to give in a little in terms of what they may, strictly speaking, call their own national sovereign kind of areas of within their national sovereignty, in order to be able to extract a greater degree of benefit from the larger purpose, the larger multilateral sort of cake, as it were, in order to be able to make the cake bigger and therefore be able to benefit all communities. And in that sense, I mean smartness in that sense. And that smartness a very important component of that smartness is inclusivity and equality of consideration. And of course, it is important, particularly in the context of what has been happening recently, for there to be no sense of exceptionalism. I think as we look into the future now, I have a few points which I need to make in addition to this question of meeting challenges in a smart way with respect to being able to provide greater outlay of funds and a better way of handling them. I think there has to be some structural, a relook at the structure. And that is where I say the basic structure of the United Nations, if the UN is to be credible for another 25 or 50 years at the very least, I think there has to be a certain relook at the basic structure. As I said at the outset itself, there has been a change, a basic change in the world today, in the structure of world politics today. And though there has been, of course, people like Deng Xiaoping in the late 80s and early 90s, when Rajiv Gandhi visited China, I recall, because I was part of the delegation. I was joint secretary in the East Asia division when he did that. The two leaders, when they met, they did look forward to what Deng Xiaoping said, the 21st century will not be an Asian century if it does not include the development of both India and China and India, as he said then. Today, of course, the situation under Xi Jinping is slightly different because the Chinese have been able to leverage both their place in the United Nations as a permanent member of the Security Council, but also by leveraging some of the benefits that they've been able to negotiate in forums like the WTO to actually build up over the last 20 or 30 years an incredible amount of economic development. And I think they've been able to leverage all the advantages of the political relationships they have developed with the West in a manner where their economy has speeded forward so fast that even the earlier restraint, the so-called biding your time strategy, which Deng Xiaoping had talked about, has now been completely set aside, and China is now very openly and somewhat muscularly using wolf warrior diplomacy and things like that, which to some extent has actually been even counterproductive. My own impression is in the UN has been that the Chinese over the past decade or so has actually it has actually, in a sense, has increased both its profile, its financial contributions. There was a time when it was among the lower half of the contributors to the regular budget. Today, it is the second largest contributor to the regular budget. It is also the second largest contributor to the peacekeeping budget. So China has actually developed in a big way. But I think it is important, as I think recently, it is important not just to be there as a big player, but it has today the United Nations, you have to take the community, the larger community of member states also with you. And while it is true that the Chinese have begun to pose almost an alternative kind of format, as it were, or an alternative structure, I don't think that kind of alternative is the change that I was thinking of. It has to be something that will work with most countries, not just meet the interests of one or two major countries. Therefore, you need to have. I'm not saying that we must disregard the reality of the power structure today. That is the position of the United States and China. In fact, I think the UN tends to obsess about it. But we need to consider that the United Nations must respond to the concerns of other powers, particularly the middle powers, more regularly. And as the restructuring of the Security Council is absolutely essential, I think that it has to be done eventually if the UN has to achieve or at least retain the credibility it has so far. Now, understanding the nuances of the present P5 position is one thing, but I think there are things where the United Nations, particularly in the Secretariat, and I've seen this at close hands. The United Nations Secretary General, for example, needs to not be caught up in the crosshair of the differences between the various P5 members. As one major colleague of mine in the Secretariat, Lakhdar Brahimi said, the Security Council must be told what it needs to hear, not what it would like to hear. And I think that is perhaps the biggest need of the hour, particularly in the context of the increasing role which the United Nations Secretariat has to take with regard to working outside the parameters of member states alone. And therefore, it has to speak frankly when there is a disjunct between what is happening and what the Security Council permanent members would like to happen. And I think that today, that sense of being able to show the mirror to the Security Council is not being performed as effectively as it should. I recall, for example, one of the reasons why I was called to the United Nations, I was asked to join the Secretariat in 2006, was at a time, the last year of Kofi Annan's Secretary Generalship, which was in a sense a year of considerable difficulty for him, because he had faced considerable pressure as a result of his own statements, his own criticism of the United States action, the US government's action in Iraq, which is done outside the United Nations, but which he, in fact, at one stage even described as illegal. And it was this, the ire of the permanent member, the most powerful member of the Security Council, which actually resulted in a wholesale, in a sense, almost a recasting of the senior management of the United Nations. And many of the people whom he had worked on earlier were out of the 38th floor. And in some ways, I think it was in a sense, to set the balance right, that he had asked for some senior diplomats or ambassadors from the non-aligned countries like India to join him. And I was witness to an attempt to re-center, as it were, the work of the Secretariat without losing his dignity. And I think I do recognize that Kofi Annan, the late Kofi Annan, was perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most charismatic Secretary Generals that we have had in modern history. The other being, of course, Dag Hammarskjöld, who, of course, died in 1962, again, having gotten into the crosshairs of important members of the organization. Now, I think the Secretariat has therefore to be a lot more neutral as it moves forward, and it has to, of course, work. It cannot. I think there are a whole series of the appointments, the way in which it works with the Security Council, mainly on political affairs, but more broadly, the way in which the Secretariat, the UN Secretariat, works with the specialized agencies is to provide a much greater degree of, let's say, political direction. I don't mean political in a narrow sense, a political direction to the various specialized agencies in order to move them towards a broader, let's say, inclusivity towards meeting the needs of the world. And I think that is now being done. The new Secretary General, Guterres, has actually brought out a much greater degree of reform, which works both at the country level in terms of the reorganization of the work of the resident coordinators and how they react, the way in which the regional organizations are working, and how the headquarters works vis-a-vis the field. And I think there is a much greater degree of, let's say, synergy, which is now being brought about. But this synergy is not only, it's possible only if there is much greater degree of, let's say, consultation and consensus building, which includes more than just the P5. The P5 remain, there is no doubt today, the major movers and shakers of the United Nations, not just in the political field, but even in the non-political field. Some of it is not necessarily, let's say, deleterious, because I think, for example, you will probably know that it was this year that the World Food Program was awarded the the Nobel Peace Prize. I think as you probably know, the United States is one of the largest funders of the World Food Program, and I think the World Food Program, by and large, has been working in a highly non-politicized manner. It is one of the foremost, let's say, humanitarian organizations. It has a very, let's say, lean budget. It has not as many members. I mean, not staffed as much as the FAO and others, but it works with a whole series of other humanitarian organizations in very imaginative ways. And I think that is the kind of so let's say governance that suggests itself increasingly for most of the other specialized programs also. And I think from this point of view, I think there's some other small issues, but I think what is most important is that the United Nations, in its build-up for the 75th anniversary, had actually started a whole public media engagement program called UN at 75. And I think the most interesting that they've tried to do is they said that what we want to do is to listen increasingly to the people of the world. And I think that has been a very interesting program that it has for almost a year. And I think it has helped the UN to integrate itself very much more with the sentiment, particularly in the social media and other parts of the world. In some ways, I have not been au fait with the developments. I'm a bit of a dinosaur in terms of the social media. I've not at all been clipped onto the social media, but the UN has been very active on the social media. And in that sense, I think it is increasingly now it is able to feel, as it were, the sentiments around the world, what is happening on almost an immediate basis. And I think it is important not to be carried away, of course, by these temporary and these immediate sentiments, but at the same time, to be able to get a pulse of where the people of the world are moving, what the indications are, and how they view the work of the UN, the work of the major powers, and the work particularly that is not done, remains to be done in meeting the expectations and requirements of the most vulnerable people, the refugees, the people who are actually even the environment refugees, the people who are actually on the wrong side, and the people who have migrated. These are the kind of populations that need the attention of the world, and they're the ones who suffer the most. And if the United Nations is not able to reach them, they will suffer by the roadside. And it is from that point of view that even the SDG slogan of "Leave no one behind" finds a great deal of resonance. And I think it is this particular, on the one hand, the SDGs, the other, the disaster risk reduction, then the humanitarian activities of in the food and other and disease, etc., and of course the United Nations on the political and developmental side. This, I think, is the future that we need to safeguard. And I probably end by saying that the United Nations, then when it was founded as now, despite all its difficulties, is an indispensable organization. I don't think you can do without the United Nations. You may find a lot of fault with it. You may criticize it. I think you must criticize it. You may find that their criticism, that the United Nations criticism of individual countries or individual governments at some times and on various occasions are very embarrassing, and you don't like to hear it. Just as I think when yesterday President Trump talked about how filthy the environment in India is, obviously you don't like it. But I think there is some truth somewhere in it which you need to at least turn your eyes on and be able to at least reflect on it. And if you can reflect on it, I think the UN will have done it, done something useful. My own sense is, I think there is an incredible amount of inspirational figures in the United Nations. The idea of multilateralism itself, I think, is something that needs to be cherished and it is important. However much we may have difficulties in our bilateral relations or in our multilateral ties, the criticisms we face, I think there's no substitute for a multilateral world, which is the world of the future. Anyway, that is my take, as it were, for you youngsters. It is for you now to take this process forward. After having spent 11 years in the United Nations now, I find myself a little out of date now. So if there are any questions, I'll be glad to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your intellectually enriching words and bestowing upon us a casket of precious knowledge. Now the house is open to questions. If you have any question, then you can use the reaction option on Zoom on the bottom of your screen, and I'll ask you to unmute and ask your question. And till the time we have some questions from YT. First question is from Pragya. Pragya, you unmute.
A very good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for such an enlightening session.
Yeah.
So the question is, as you all know that in the contemporary context, one of the very few positive outcomes have been the environmental optimism. So how do you think that it will help UN and related institutions to fulfill their goals and roles, and as you mentioned, SDGs, related to tackling the climatic hazards that we are facing globally at present?
Well, I think the whole question of environment, of how to address environment, is largely a question of mobilization. It's largely a question of bringing greater awareness. I mean, much of the awareness or the lack of awareness that we see at governmental levels is not because of lack of information. It is because of a certain amount of political blindness or color blindness in some ways. Some governments just do not see green anywhere. They can see everything else, but no. Now that's more like what Mahatma Gandhi said: you can't awaken a person who's pretending to sleep. You can only awaken a person if he's sleeping. But I think by and large, around the world, there is a strong sense. There's an absence of information about what processes are workable and what processes are not workable. Now, it is true that in countries like India, there is there is a dilemma in terms of, is development more important, or is it important for us, is environment more important? This is a false choice. This is actually a false choice. Now, it is important that when you're finger pointing countries like India, it is very sensitive when you say that India is not doing this. The developed countries do that, who face a lot of responsibility for bringing out this problem in the first place. And when they point the finger, there is a certain degree of sensitivity. But at the same time, I think most decision makers in India are fairly clear that they are responsible for the impact of developmental choices that they make on the environment. And it is important that they take the choices that are least energy, that are most energy intensive and least carbon sort of intensive in that sense. And I think while there are countries which are able to do it, when in areas where they are not able to do it, particularly in the case of the SIDS and of the LDCs, it is important that they get the financial resources from the more developed part of the world in order to do it. And I think this is what a proper sense of understanding environmental options should consist of. And I think this, as I think in the last September, in September 2019, there was a summit in September where the Secretary General precisely said that it is important that you have greater degree of ambition in terms of meeting environmental targets.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your question. Next up, we have Tarsh. Tarsh, if you're here.
Yeah.
Sir, my question is, after the pandemic, will we witness a sort of a shift in power in the United Nations, and can it somehow affect the permanent members?
It's a very interesting question you asked. Now, are you talking about a shift in power in terms of within the P5, or you're talk about a shift of power affecting the P5? Now, I am a little reluctant to suggest that this pandemic would actually result in a major power shift around the world or in the UN. Of course, there is, over the years, there has been a slow, in a sense, a revolution taking place, particularly in the way in which China has been asserting itself in the United Nations. And that will continue. There is no doubt as far as I can see. If anything, that the COVID has had some implications for that in terms of how China has reacted in the first place, as well as in later in terms of how it has responded in terms of its work with other countries. This is both some positive signs and some negative signs. And I'm sure that that will impact, and it has actually impacted in terms of the image that China projects around the world, particularly in the United Nations, in the international community as a whole, and in the United Nations too. But I will hesitate to say that there will be any major dramatic effects. The dramatic effects will actually, I think, be nationally seen. And then if there is a major change in the United States, for example, that will obviously be seen in the way in which the United Nations is treated by the United States government, the subsequent government that comes. Now, for example, walking out of organizations, the United Nations, mind you, the United States, mind you, is still the largest contributor to the UN budget. It is also no secret that New York as a city gains a lot by the fact that it is the center of that the UN headquarters is in New York. But at the same time, I think that there's a huge amount of goodwill for the United Nations inside the United States also. Now, this must be leveraged, I think, for more productive purpose rather than what we have been seeing over the past few years, particularly under the Trump, where the United States has viewed the United Nations with a great deal of cynicism. And I think while it is true that there is need for a very careful scrutiny of what is happening, and of what is happening, whether in terms of management, in terms of programs, in terms of processes, in terms of people, yes, there should be that. But when a country like the United States starts divesting itself of international commitments, I think that vacuum is actually filled up by others, and sometimes that is filled up not necessarily for the good of these organizations or for good of multilateralism in general.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your answer. Tash, do you have any follow-up questions, or are you satisfied with the answer?
Well, I might say that, there are some people who talk about middle powers and things like that. These will happen, and there is the United Nations, though I have given the impression that it is the P5 that runs the show in the United Nations on most issues, it is only partly true. Even they have to face up in the General Assembly and in the ECOSOC, in the Economic and Social Council too. It is not possible for them to ride roughshod over the views of other members. And I think there are some incredibly active diplomats in the from smaller countries. As you know, what is it? Was it Tuvalu or was it Samoa? Yeah, I think it was one country, the permanent representative, the ambassador of one country, a small country like Samoa, or was it Tuvalu? I'm not so sure. Who in Copenhagen during the COP15 was able to completely, in a sense, halt the juggernaut that was coming in terms of a kind of an understanding and agreement which was actually worked out from outside by the great powers, including India and China and others. But Samoa found that was not working to his advantage, and they just completely stymied it. So it's not necessarily true that that the big power, the powerful people get their work all the time.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for your response.
Yeah.
Third, we have Adhiraj. Do we have Adhiraj here?
Yes. Good afternoon, sir. So my question to you is, as we know, the current world order is witnessing rise of China and the situation of Cold War between China and the US. So, sir, considering this situation, do you think the effectiveness of UN would eventually decrease?
It's difficult. I'm not going to say that the influence of the UN will decrease because of the fight between China and the US. Now, it is possible that may logjam a lot of programs inside the UN. Again, there are programs and programs. There are a number of, now in a sense, I don't know whether this is what you're suggesting. The Chinese have over the past years taken a fairly strong, strident sort of actions in the UN. They today pay around 12% of the regular budget, and they actually are heading 4 organizations in the UN: the FAO, the UNIDO, the ITU, and the ICAO. And they tried to get the 5th, the WIPO, and which of course didn't succeed because of the very, very strong opposition put up by the US and others, and the West particularly, and by putting up the candidature of Singapore. And even in some of the sort of elections that took place recently for the Council of Women, actually, there is I think just recently the Commission on the Status of Women, China lost to India. India was able to get, and later on, in fact, around the same time, China also lost to Samoa for entry into the Statistical Commission. China lost to Singapore, as I said, in the candidate of the WIPO. Now, these show that irrespective of the bilateral competition, the rivalry, the Cold War, the decoupling that you're seeing, I wouldn't say Cold War, incipient Cold War, that we are seeing, almost on the horizon between China and the United States. In the United Nations, there is a slightly different dynamic that works, and I think that dynamic is affected, but it's also leveraged by countries, and they make the best advantage of it. And it is important for countries like China and the United States to realize that they need to work with a large number of countries together and build coalitions. And I think that is a process which is handled by both countries, of course, very effectively. As you know, the BRI, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, is of course handled by China with various countries on a separate footing. But there are many ways in which the Chinese are trying to, in a sense, implicate the United Nations also in some of these programs. Of course, they face some hurdles. They face differences from other countries, including the West, and on some occasions, India has also has made some drafting changes, etc., where there is too overt and too, what we feel, unjustified references to Chinese concepts, as it were, which in a sense detract, like community of common destiny and things like that. There have been occasions when the Chinese have faced differences, but this is not to suggest that they are not making very strong inroads in the United Nations. They are doing it, and that is being done by all countries, including India. And I think India is still fairly active in the and fairly influential in the United Nations. And I think it's a kind of a balance that, on the whole, is actually improving the effectiveness of multilateral diplomacy in the United Nations. And I think that will continue. I wouldn't say it will be affected very bad. It will make the UN ineffective. If the UN is ineffective, it will be for some other reasons. It won't be for this.
Thank you, sir. Adhiraj, do you have the follow-up, or it's fine?
Just one small question.
Yeah.
So after World War One, so the League of Nations was constructed so that it could prevent the World War Two. But despite of that, it still happened. And so now we know that the superpowers they now have nuclear weapons also. And sir, if by chance a war broke out, so if they use that nuclear powers, the atrocities and the casualties will be absolutely brutal. So just UN, can the UN avoid World War Three if situations get very worse between the two countries, either
Well,
with China or any other country?
let me say that so far, 75 years, the UN has survived and avoided a world war. Of course, there have been a large number of a nuclear holocaust has been averted. And let me tell you that as you said, the world went from the First World War. We descended very steeply into a Second World War very soon, despite the League of Nations. But you know, the League of Nations did not include the United States. Now, how do you have an international organization? It's like this thing, Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, or things like that. That was one thing. Secondly, the Soviet Union left the League of Nations in 1934. So these are the things, and that is where I said the reality of the organization. And in fact, it was for that reason, essentially, that you had the status of the permanent members and the P5, etc. And I think that is important. It's important that you recognize the reality of the power structure in the world. The fact is, today that power structure is changing. And it is important that that change, that reality has to be recognized. If you try to take measures without reference to the real world, then I think the United Nations will follow the same path as the League of Nations. And that is the point I'm making now, that there is a structural change that has taken place, a major change which has taken place in the balance of the world in recent times, which includes India and China. There's no doubt about it. And of course, for the present, I think the change that is taking place has not affected India, has not included India, because I think the change has not become so disruptive. India is still able to work within the world. But if a time comes when our interests are not subserved by our participation in the world organization, or in fact, the world organization goes continuously on a path which is completely different from ours, it will be important for countries like India to wonder whether the interest is worth, whether the interest of the world is subserved by this kind of an organization or by another organization. I hope that it doesn't happen. I don't think it will happen. I think that the UN will see the light by that time, and there will be reasonable and important reform which will take place in the United Nations.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so we have the last question of the day from Piyush Jorwal. I'd like you to unmute yourself and ask the question, please. Jorwal.
Ayush, I think there is some technical problem here, and I think due to technical problem, he left the meeting.
Oh,
so
Okay, it's fine. We can take one more question. Then, okay, I have another question. It's from Varalika. The question is that the big tech companies such as Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and FB have monopolistic holds over a large amount of economic income of the world. It is unlikely that US will work towards regulating these giants. So should the UN step in to help startups build themselves in the post-pandemic world?
Well, that's a very interesting question. But you probably know the US is already taking action against Google in the last few days. Now, I don't know whether that is the kind of action that you are thinking of that should be taken. Second is the question is, how does the UN take action against individual companies, as it were? Because companies fall under the ambit of national law. It doesn't come under international law unless it violates some kind of international sort of covenant or convention or things like that. Now, the UN's work, particularly as involves these kind of important companies, will be to evolve or to construct a framework of multilateral commitments and agreements which will meet the needs of all countries, which will prevent the outsized or disproportionate influence by some companies like Google or like Amazon and things like that, and build for a better playing field, a more level playing field among all countries and help the vulnerable and give scope for some kind of protective measures. Now that will be in the shape of an international understanding, and that cannot be done by the UN alone. It has to be done by all the member states through the UN. Now the UN can do it from that point of view, but it can't directly work with individuals. It can't really haul up one company or two companies and say that becomes invidious, and it's unlikely to be actually countenanced. Even if it is justified, I don't think national governments will agree to that kind of a treatment.
Thank you, sir.
On the other hand, through the global, there are the global, the global compact and things like that. The United Nations has a series of agreements and understandings with important companies, and there they can evolve a kind of a regime which all parties will be committed to, and that will help. That is how it goes.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
So with this, we have come to an end of the final session of Vrittant. Thank you so much, sir, for this enriching and didactic session, and going thoroughly with your answers and explaining us in each and every intricacies of the structure of UN.
Thank you.
Now I would like to call upon the Vice President of Political Science Students Association, Soumya Sharma, for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ayush. First of all, a very good afternoon to one and all present here with us. So I think it is fair to conclude that the conclave was a great success. So on behalf of the entire Political Science Department, I'd like to thank Ambassador Vijay NAMBIAR sir for being here and enlightening us about the future of UN in the post-pandemic world. Thank you, sir, for such an insightful and informative session. We loved having you. It was an honor listening to a refreshing perspective on this.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank Ambassador DILIP Sinha sir, Professor CSR Murthy sir, and Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh sir for gracing our event as our esteemed speakers. And at last, so many people have contributed in so many ways to make sure that the conclave was a success. So firstly, I'd like to express our deep sense of appreciation for our principal, Dr. S. Venkat sir, for bestowing upon us the opportunity of organizing the conclave. And obviously, a big thanks to the professors for their guidance and support that they have provided throughout. We wouldn't have been able to do this without them. I'd also like to express heartfelt gratitude to all those who joined in for all the conclave sessions. I hope it was an enriching experience for all of you as well. And also thanks to all those who participated in the competitions with great enthusiasm. And at last, since we all know no man is an island, I'd like to thank my fellow association members, as it is because of our collective efforts and tenacity that this event was made possible. And I know this speech has been full of thanks, but our hearts are filled with nothing but only gratitude right now. So finally, thank you so much, everybody, for making Vrittant Vocalizing Visions, our first ever department conclave, a huge success. We wouldn't have been able to do this without each one of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you,
sir.
Mr. CSR, I think Murthy has had an article in the Hindu today.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir, I read about it.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Sir.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, sir.